Welcome to the module Elements of Rigor in the Common Core Classroom. My name is Leslie Zaroya, and I'm a Reading Language Arts consultant here at the Los Angeles County Office of Education. Today, we have three primary goals. First, let's look at the notion of rigor and define what it is, and honestly, what it's not, which in some ways is just as important. There are many notions about the idea of rigor, and let's clear that up, but more on that in a minute. Then I'd like to take it to a practical level and look at what makes a lesson rigorous. What elements help to not only engage kids, but take their thinking to higher levels? And finally, we'll watch a short video of a classroom lesson and see if we can identify some of the elements of a rigorous lesson in action. Before we launch into it, there are a couple of handouts listed in the box underneath the PowerPoint slides, the resources box. Make sure you download these and have them ready to go as we go through this quick introduction on rigor. Also, if you have questions, there will be time at the end and a chat box will appear for you to be able to ask questions or make comments. Okay, here we go. So the first question we might logically begin with is, why is rigor such a big deal? Why are we even focusing on the idea of rigor as we implement the Common Core state standards? Well, essentially, rigor is the foundation of the Common Core standards. If our goal in the standards is to prepare students for the world of college and career and enable them to be successful in a global society, then we have to look at the complexity of the readings and tasks students are asked to tackle. So with the increased use of a lot of primary source documents and informational texts, we know students are going to need skills to grapple with the structure, academic language, and complexity of ideas outside of the traditional sort of story grammar, meaning the style and structure of literature that students are familiar with. On top of that, we also now have the need to push students to seek evidence for the thoughts, ideas, inferences, and conclusions that arise from the readings they're engaged in. There's been a shift from not only relating to a reading in a personal sense to make meaning, which I think has been a great focus in the past few years, to get at the relevance issue and draw students into a text. But now we're including the notion of text-based evidence and anchoring that academic discourse in the classroom in the actual text material. It's not enough to have students just share thoughts and ideas on a topic or reading. Students need to be able to relate those ideas to specific material in the text and justify their conclusions with evidence. So you can see that rigor now sort of moves up the list of priorities in preparing students to do all of this. And the focus on rigor now becomes a little clearer. So now let's look at the notion of rigor itself. What is it? How can we define it in a way that is both concrete and practical? This can be tricky. I think we often throw terms like rigor around, yet it's not totally clear what it means, and what it means may be different in different people's minds. So I really like this particular definition. I think it clarifies both the idea and the process. Let's go through it, starting with the first part. A rigorous curriculum is an inclusive set of intentionally aligned components. Clear learning outcomes with matching assessments, engaging learning experiences, and instructional strategies. Okay, let's stop there for a sec. I love the phrase intentionally aligned. This is critical. First, everything teachers do in a lesson needs to be intentional. Seems simple, but it's not. I think often as teachers we sort of wing it when it comes to working through text. We have discussion, but it's loose and flows where it goes. This isn't a terrible thing, but it can lead to getting way off track. Some digression and flow is fine, but with intentionality comes focus. So with a rigorous curriculum, teachers really need to think hard about where they intend to lead students. This means higher level, text-dependent questions worked out ahead of time, and close reading experiences pre-planned with a specific focus. More on that later. Let's keep going with the definition. So the next part, and I'm back to the slide here, organized into sequenced units of study that serve as both the detailed roadmap and the high-quality delivery system for ensuring that all students achieve the desired end, the attainment of their designated grade or course-specific standards within a particular content area. Okay, so the red highlighted part is where I want to focus again. We talked about intentionally aligned components, and now the second part, organized into sequenced units of study. The key for me is sequenced. Not only is the lesson intentional, it's sequential. Maybe it begins with a DOK level 1 or a lower level activity or question, but through the course of the lesson, it progresses and floats between levels 2 and 3 as students gain conceptual understanding and work through text. So the long and short of it really is about the notion of intentionally aligned components that are sequential in nature. So it's not just what you are teaching, meaning the content, like the Lexile level or text complexity level, but how you teach it. Think intentional. As you plan lessons or review lesson plans, think about the intentionality. Do the activities and assignments lead sequentially to a clear outcome? And how will we know when we walk into a room? Well, partly it's measured by what students know, understand, and are able to do. Perfect example of this. Last week, I was in a classroom, and this particular school has class ambassadors. So anytime a visitor enters the class, a designated student greets the visitor and gives a short spiel on what they are studying and what they might see in the room. So the boy comes over and introduces himself and tells me that they are engaged in project-based learning at his school, and their current theme is identity, so they've been reading a book set in the 1960s about a family that goes through a horrible crisis. And what was so amazing about this boy's little spiel was the clarity with which he was able to articulate the goal of the unit, the big ideas, and the project they were currently undertaking. It was so obvious that he knew the objective, was immersed in attaining it, and felt confident in his ability to do so. This all took place in under a minute, but it was obvious in the room that some very intentional work had been done. Okay, let's move on. So briefly, let's look for a minute at what rigor is not. So I'm referring to the right side of the slide now. Back in the day, and I may be dating myself here, the quote-unquote GATE kids were supposedly doing rigorous work. What that ended up looking like in a practical, real-life sense was more work, which was called harder, and instead of doing 20 math problems, they did 50. Today, it may look like an AP class or a class that takes on a difficult text, like Proust or something. But here's the thing. None of that ensures any measure of actual rigor. The difficult text is a piece of it, but what matters is what is done with that text, the process of working through the text. So let's look at the left side of the slide. Rigor really is planning for thinking ahead of time, not on the spur of the moment while reading and stopping to discuss, but thinking and intentionally and sequentially deciding in which direction the thinking will go, and planning questions, assignments, and activities to lead to deeper thinking. It's also scaffolded support for thinking, meaning that the teacher doesn't just throw a random high-level question into the wind and see who it may stick to. Instead, the teacher skillfully plans each question and guides students in the process as each gets increasingly more complex. This includes allowing opportunities for students to talk collaboratively and work in groups to hash through ideas and evidence. So you're probably getting the picture here that it is a lot about thinking, assessing thinking and thinking about thinking. This gets at metacognition. Having students ask themselves, so how did I come to this conclusion? What led me here? What clues in the text did I pick up on? Did my partner's comments influence me? Was it easier to do on my own or in a group? All of these metacognitive questions help students to become confident and independent thinkers. And let's face it, attaining the ultimate goal of the standards requires independent thinkers who can confidently navigate the world on their own. I love this cartoon. Those of you who are Facebookers will recognize this from the batch of snarky cartoons that are often shared. It makes me think of my own kids when they were young, and I would ask them, "What'd you do in school today?" I'm pretty sure the answer never involved an awesome worksheet. The times I remember my own kids being excited about something they did in school usually centered on an experience and a feeling of having done something well that was meaningful and rewarding. I think rigor is all about this. Meaningful, thoughtful, engaging, high-level work. Okay, I digressed a little. So I'm sure you are all familiar with Bloom's taxonomy. I love this chart and the new 21st century way of approaching blooms. On the left is the original blooms. Notice they are all nouns. On the right is the updated version, and these are all active verbs. I feel like this is sort of a metaphor for Common Core. Common Core asks kids to be active, not passive learners. The emphasis on high-level thinking combined with collaborative processes all point to teachers as facilitators, leading students on an intentional journey. It reminds me of the saying, guide on the side, not sage on the stage. Who is doing all of the work, the teacher or the students? The new blooms require students to do all of those active verbs, like remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, etc. So, before we hit the elements of a rigorous lesson, there's a resource I want to share with you. Hopefully you downloaded Karen Hess's Cognitive Rigor Matrix. This is an awesome little tool. She basically combines Bloom's and Webb's DOK levels. So how I would use this is in both creating lessons and evaluating lessons. It's a great chart for determining where each assignment or activity falls in the spectrum of thinking levels. So let's say a teacher was having students analyze the poem The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. And students were directed to look at the use of repetition in the poem for thematic impact. So if we look on the chart, we want to identify where in both Bloom's and DOK this might fall. Take a minute to locate the cell that this activity falls. When you're ready, answer the poll question, which Bloom's level does this fall into, and which DOK level? I'd say the level is probably apply on Bloom's and DOK level 2. All right, so let's look at some elements that you may see in a rigorous lesson. Again, the focus is intentional planning, meaning that you would have a clear objective, do background building, use collaborative processes, allow for multiple reads, utilize close reading strategies, have graduated thinking levels, and an assessment that matches and demonstrates attaining the objective. So let's go through each one of these little areas in a little more detail. So starting with clear objective. Having a clear objective is crucial. I know this seems a little obvious and simple, but if the teacher does not have an idea of what students need to accomplish each day, how can they be intentional in getting them there? The idea of an objective is also often confused with an agenda. Teachers list what they will do that day on the board, like read chapter 6, answer questions, etc. But this is not an objective. An objective is a concrete goal to be accomplished. A good way to remember the difference is to have it start with phrases like students will, or students will be able to, will identify reasons why the main character committed the crime and find textual evidence to support their ideas. It should be measurable and tied to standards that are identified in the lesson. Here's a big reason to have a clear objective. It helps kids feel secure in what the expectations are for that day. If they can understand it, restate it, find relevance in it, and feel they can actually attain it, the foundation is set to have a great lesson. Next is setting the stage. So building background knowledge is something I think teachers are used to doing. The trick is to do this without giving away the farm. Sometimes in our attempt to front load, we tell students so much that there's nothing for them to discover on their own. It kind of ruins the anticipation and impetus to read. But there are things teachers can do though, like previewing a few conceptual academic terms and looking at text structure and clues. Another big bang for your buck idea is to have students discover the background material themselves in collaborative groups. Not only does it stick more than someone telling them about it, but it provides a purpose to do the real work of the lesson. One note of caution. Try not to stray too far off of the original objective when building background. It shouldn't take an exorbitant amount of time and have activities that don't really lead towards mastery of the stated standards and objectives. I was in a class recently where the teacher was having students draw a map of Europe during World War II as background for Anne Frank. My question to the teacher was, how does drawing a map help set the contextual background of World War II? Why do they need to draw it? Could they just look at a map? How will it help them understand the backdrop of the war as it relates to the novel? In my mind, it's sort of a time killer, busy work. Just because kids look busy doesn't mean it's meaningful work that actually sets the stage for the learning. So at any rate, the big idea here is to be strategic and intentional about what students need as background to be successful in the lesson. All right, next is opportunities for collaboration. So as you know, there's a huge emphasis on collaboration in the Common Core state standards. Some teachers are very comfortable with a lot of student collaboration, others are not. Training kids to be good collaborators is really critical. By having built-in partner and group work that is both written and oral accountability attached, students are training to work collaboratively in the real world. By practicing the exchange of ideas in a controlled environment, students can see the relevance of the work and also learn to appreciate both agreeing and disagreeing with others. Such a valuable life skill. Plus, let's face it, most of the time it's just easier and more fun to have someone to talk to about the work. The next element is multiple reads. In our former standards, I felt like there was never time for this because there were so many standards to try and squeeze into the lesson. Now, though, the Common Core state standards are fewer and deeper and actually require students to do more than one read-through of a text. No matter which methods you use to do the various reads, read aloud, silent read, whole group, whatever, the critical piece here is to have a focus prompt for each read. Students are very hesitant to read anything. Reread, rewrite, redo, not in their vocabulary. But when the reread is targeted for a specific purpose, like read to see if you can find examples of how this character shows indifference to her brother, and then actually debrief and do something with the information, students don't seem to mind so much. It teaches them the layers of analyzing and what you can discover by taking a slightly different approach. So, of course, we know close reading is a foundational skill in the Common Core standards. Students must learn to read closely in order to analyze and evaluate text. How we scaffold that is really important. The most crucial factor is having a teacher who facilitates, not lectures and explains and does the analyzing for them, but a teacher who is, like we said before, the guide on the side, not the sage on the stage. Using scaffolded note templates and chunking the text are strategies that help students analyze without feeling completely overwhelmed. The debriefing process is also crucial in close reading. Students need to both share their own ideas as well as listen and evaluate the ideas of their peers. This is where some amazing learning can take place. Students can learn from each other about the clues and ideas they've pulled from the text. It also teaches perseverance through the realization that everyone struggles sometimes with what they read. But if you break it down and look for clues and have a little toolbox of tricks to get you through, it can be done. The reason for effective close reading facilitation is simple. If you tell me everything, what motivation do I have to read it? If all I have to do is sit here and listen to someone else interpret it, why should I bother to be involved? It suggests my ideas don't matter. Independence and confidence is fostered by exhibiting valued ideas with evidence and engaging in meaningful dialogue about the task. When students are led through this process by a skilled facilitator, they gain the experience and confidence to take risks in academic settings. So valuable. Okay, quickly, the next element is on graduated thinking levels. 3 big ideas here. Number 1. If your lesson starts and ends at the remembering or DOK level 1, something went astray. Aim for at least 2 DOK levels in a given lesson. Number 2, the content does not always have to be grade level, new content, or difficult content when practicing a higher level thinking skill. Sometimes using a familiar reading to teach a high level skill for the first time is a good way to go. Students are not bogged down in the content, so the skill can be the focus. I used to do this in my ELD class a lot. I'd teach a new reading skill first within the context of the 3 Little Pigs, and then take it to grade level text. This freed them up, lowering the cognitive load, if you will, so they could focus on the higher level skill. Here's another thing. students should be able to identify DOK levels. It shouldn't be a mystery to them. By knowing the level and the expectation for critical thinking, students will be able to focus their energy on the task at hand. It can help them think metacognitively about how they are working through text. Okay, lastly, before we look at this in action in a classroom, let's talk about assessment. I always tell teachers, check each learning experience or activity. Does it lead to mastery of the objective? Is it spiraling up to higher DOK levels? Look at both the process and the product. This is critical. The process is as important or maybe even more important sometimes than the outcome. Then think to yourself, can students articulate if they met or exceeded the objective? They should be able to. If the lesson or unit was strategically and intentionally planned, students should easily be able to know if they were successful. It's also helpful to have students do a little metacognitive work along the way and at the end. And if they can analyze how well they work under what situations and if certain activities help them, it will only strengthen their ability to function in the next academic situation. It will help create independence. And wouldn't that be a fabulous outcome? Okay, so let's apply all of this to a real setting. The video you will see is a middle school reading lesson from the teaching channel, and it runs for about 6 minutes. Use the video guide note template to record evidence that you see in each area. We'll do a quick debrief when it's finished, so I'll see you in a few minutes. Okay, so if you are watching today with others in the archive, this would be a great time to go through your video guide in detail and really look at the evidence you saw in each section. But for our purposes as a webinar, I'd like to just point out a few key ideas to take away from this. First, the lesson objective was really clear. She had it on the board, a student read it, and she restated it. The room environment was conducive for collaboration in many forms, and we saw that in action. The focus questions really guided the reading and prepared students for collaboration. All students had a purpose in reading and became an expert at their small piece of background. Let's skip to the thinking levels. It started with basic information at the DOK1 or remembering level. By the time they got to the part where they were asked to interpret the meaning of the title, it pushed to a DOK2 or understanding level. And then when students had to reconstruct the speech using clues in the structure, they were at an applying and DOK2 level. This lesson was a really good example of how one teacher in one lesson addressed many elements of a rigorous lesson and created a meaningful and relevant experience for students. So this brings us to the conclusion of our little meeting. There's a chat box now for questions and comments if you would like to say something or ask a question, so feel free to do that. And please complete the online evaluation before you go, and thanks so much for attending. We'll see you next time.